Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from New York Community Bank, AmTrust Title Insurance Company, Perfect Building Maintenance, M&T Bank, Customers Bank, Marks Paneth LLP, Capital One Bank, Collins Building Services, Meridian Capital Group. Additional support has been provided by grants from AKA Hotel Residences Corman Communities, Ariel Property Advisors, Amerant Bank, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Briarwood Organization, Chase Commercial Mortgage Lending, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Citizens Bank, Dime Community Bank, Douglaston Development Levine Builders, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Handro Properties LLC, Handler Real Estate Organization, Hodges Ward Elliott INC, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, John Casamatides Red Apple Group, Keysight Capital Partners, Matone Group, New Banks, Newmark Knight Frank, Ocean First Bank, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Rockefeller Group, Rosewood Realty Services, Stonehenge NYC, SVN CPEX Real Estate Services, Tierra CRG, the Marengo Family Foundation, and these friends. Hello, my name is Michael Stola, host of the Stola Report and moderator of the AmTrust Title webinar series. Steve Napolitano, Senior Executive Vice President. Today we're having an interesting topic called data centers. With more people staying at home, working at home, data is the important element of the world today. More and more data centers are needed and there are different requirements. So today we have an investment banker who's involved with the data center and telecommunications business, and we have a banker who's involved with the data center business. Our guest today includes Jerry Tang, who is the Managing Director, the head of the industry group and global financial sponsors, real estate and hospitality for Natixis. We have Joe Valenti, Managing Director, head of the telecommunications group at PJ Solomon. So who's going to define what a data center is?
I'll kick it off, I suppose. And thanks, Michael, for moderating today, and for AmTrust for having us. Look, at its most simple level, a data center is a storage facility for information. It's a place where enterprises, cloud providers, telecommunication networks can place their equipment, their server infrastructure, so that data can be stored, computed, and exchanged amongst other parties.
Who are the top companies today in the world in the telecommunications? People don't realize that Amazon and Google are there, but who are the leaders?
Well, geez, that question probably requires a pretty broad definition and maybe a segmentation, if you will, of communications, right? So, you know, at one level, you have the names of folks that we all know, right? The folks that operate our mobile phones and our fixed line services. So the Verizons, AT&Ts of the world in this country. As it relates to this particular topic around real estate and data centers, there are a handful of global players who are the key leaders, the publicly traded REITs, Equinix, Digital Realty, CyrusOne, CoreSite, folks along those lines. You know, those are all the folks that actually own the infrastructure, own the buildings themselves, and the associated mechanical equipment and power distribution units to allow their customers to co-locate servers for purposes of the applications that they're serving.
Jerry, how did Natixis get involved with financing of the data center world?
Yeah, so we see data center from two, I guess, sectors. One is obviously real estate. It needs a place to hold, the equipments, buildings, infrastructure for the data centers. The other way is really we see the inherent contractual nature of the data centers, where it's a infrastructure that's contracted to many customers. So we see it from an infrastructure perspective as well. It's a extension of our C-fiber, fiber, and a tower business. All kind of a data, if you will, data infrastructure financing business.
Joe, you've been involved with the tower business. I think you even sold a company in the tower business. What's the difference between the tower business and the data center business?
Well, I think there's a couple of key differences, although they both enjoy the secular trends of being part of the communications infrastructure ecosystem. You know, the infrastructure that allows communication to take place, although serve different purposes. You know, on the tower side, there's a specific role and focus. It's basically to facilitate wireless transmission of information. The tower market has been largely consolidated in this country amongst three main public players: American Tower, Crown Castle, and SBA. Although there are a number of private companies that have grown significantly in scale and size, like Vertical Bridge and a handful of others. You know, key difference I would articulate between tower companies and data center companies. One, on the tower side, in addition to only having really a handful of customers that are co-locating on your tower infrastructure, generally speaking, all the contracts tend to be longer in duration, and they all tend to be with well-capitalized credit tenants. So your key customers are Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile. There are others, but those are the large ones. So you have this customer concentration dynamic that's at play. And tower companies rightfully trade, in the high 20s and even low 30s at times, which speaks to largely the durability of that revenue model and the durability of the customer base and the ubiquity and importance of having wireless services be available to the entirety of the country. Data centers share, in a lot of regards, a similar economic model in terms of being critical infrastructure, in terms of having generally long-dated contracts. But I would argue that there is a broader spectrum of offerings within the data center space, and I'm sure we'll talk about those on this panel. Everywhere from the large million-plus square foot facilities that an Amazon or a Microsoft or a Google is using, all the way down to what we call edge or containerized data centers that sit at, sometimes even at the base of a tower where compute is taking place, right at the spot where wireless transmissions are occurring. The other key difference in the data center space, I would say, is in addition to the diversity of the customer base, is the duration of the contracts. There are some that are focused more on the big public cloud providers that have very long dated contracts akin to towers. And when you look at valuations in the market, a lot of those businesses will trade on a private basis that looks and feels and smells like a tower company. But there are several that have much shorter contracts, the more retail-oriented data centers where people are taking smaller square footage within a facility, and those generally are 3 to 5 years. Both businesses, however, have been terrific performers from an equity perspective over several years, and quite frankly have withstood the test of time as it relates to this pandemic that we're all wrestling with, because the criticality of that infrastructure has become more and more obvious as we all work remotely and plan to work remotely, frankly, for an extended period of time.
In my research, I noted that there are different types of data centers. There's a co-location data center, an enterprise data center, a managed service data center, and the cloud data centers. Jerry, which ones do you like financing, or all of them?
I would say all of them. Follow Joe's comment on these, large public companies like Equinix, digital realty. I'm a guy who have grown up in real estate. So, when I first approached the data center sector, I was amazed at the scale they have. Look at Equinix. It has today it has 62 billion market cap. You're talking about 14 billion for Boston properties. SL Green is 4 billion. Vornado is 9 billion. Just the sheer scale is just amazing, and the tower companies are even bigger.
Traditional real estate lenders are comfortable with bricks and mortars. Now you're lending maybe $1,000 a square foot. You're lending on cash flow and revenue as opposed to the bricks and mortar, correct?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, there's definitely still a real estate component. You still need a place to hold the data center, the equipment, the servers, the cooling systems. And then you have the data center interior infrastructure, right? But mostly, you're right. I would say 70–80% of that cost structure or capex is beyond the real estate. That's why in a small suburb in Washington D.C. called Ashburn, you see the data centers are being traded at $1,500 per square foot. For real estate guys, it's just amazing. It's more expensive than a CBD Manhattan Class A office. How do you grasp that? So you have to recognize that the data center market is maybe Joe can elaborate more. It's very I would say concentrated in several top markets. Like in the U.S., you have DC, you have Dallas, Phoenix. Obviously Silicon Valley, Chicago. These are the large metropolitan areas that have great connectivity, where you have the internet connection points, key points. You're connected to the internet, and you have plentiful of cheap power, which is essential for the data centers because they consume so much power. That's why when people talk about the data centers, they don't talk about a square footage. How big is this data center? You don't talk about it's a million square feet. You talk about it's 100 megawatts. 1 mega is about 10,000 square foot.
But I'd say the large locations are 1 million square feet. The center in Chicago, the center of the NSA bubble tree are 1 million square foot data centers. These are huge. And then if you take into consideration in New Jersey, in Edison, New Jersey, you have the former New York Times headquarters, which is a data center, which is probably 500,000, 600,000 square feet. Can we take a retail shopping mall that's been vacant, no longer JCPenney, no more Kmart or anything like that, and build that and make that a data center?
Yeah, let me take a crack at responding to that, and maybe just by way of framing the size conversation that you gentlemen were having. The largest data center in the world actually is about 6.3 million square feet. It's over in China, called the Inner Mongolian Information Park. China Telecom owns it, right? So the scale of these things is just absolutely enormous. To answer your question, Michael, maybe I'll take it two different ways. First and foremost, maybe reframe it a little bit. Have other properties for alternative uses ever been transformed to be data centers? And the simple answer is yes, they have. There have been, as you mentioned, the New York Times building. You probably are also aware of several other buildings globally that may have been used for things like semiconductor manufacturing, etc. They have all been turned into data centers at this point, and some great companies have been spawned out of those facilities that were overbuilt for the original purposes and then subsequently monetized by smart folks who saw the opportunity to turn it into a data center. That all said, think about the infrastructure that lives inside a data center and how important it is for the customers of those data centers. Most facilities will have at least a 5 nines SLA requirement, 5 nines being the data center has to be up 99.999% of the time or more. And to do that, you have to have a few things. One, you have to have the right physical security for sure, and you have to make sure that it's staffed appropriately and has the appropriate fencing and manpower and man traps, etc. But you also have to have the right technology redundancy, right? So that means having a diverse set of fiber providers to take the information that wants to come into the data center and then wants to move out of the data center in a way that protects the users of that facility. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if you had a property that had a single strand of fiber laid to it for purposes of communication, there are very few customers that are going to look at that and say, well, geez, I want to put my critical IT equipment there because the day that somebody decides they're going to dig up the street and fix a sewer, and they cut that fiber, all of a sudden that data center is useless. So one or two things happens. Usually the data center provider, will seek ways to get other telecom providers, network providers to lay fiber into that facility, and there's an expense associated with that. Certain circumstances, those network providers want to be in the facility because there's so much traffic and information that they can move and become customers of theirs. But it's really on a case-by-case basis. There's no uniform response to can a facility be turned into a data center. The question really has to be addressed on a bespoke basis as to where it is, what sort of applications might sit there. Because remember, as we were talking about beforehand, some of these facilities in New York have got significant access to, or Chicago or Dallas or the other places that Jerry referenced, significant access to fiber density and connectivity. If you go put a facility out in the middle of nowhere, it's very expensive to go potentially lay that fiber there, even though the cost of the real estate may be less expensive. So you have to be thoughtful about, if you're going to repurpose a facility, well, what applications are going to sit there? If it's something that is more disaster recovery oriented or not latency sensitive, things like your photos on your iPhone. At the end of the day, it's probably not critical if you can't get your photos for an hour, or if it even goes down for a day. You might be irritated and frustrated by that, but it's really not a life and death situation like something related to telehealth or some other critical service. So it really depends on what application is going to go into the facility, and ultimately, can you repurpose it to satisfy those applications?
Jerry, let's talk about specific type of transactions. Before, you were saying to me you have a transaction in the Virginia area. Tell me about the transaction, the amount of financing, the percentage, loan to value, and loan per square foot, and so on.
So we were looking at a new construction data center deal where the operator, namely the real estate owner, they have lined up some really large public cloud operator, one of the Google, Amazon, Facebook, one of the firms for a long-term lease. So on that, we were able to come up with a pretty, compelling financing proposal, in the range of 70 to 80% loan to costs, because we were more relying on the lease, what the lease will get us versus, the actual cost. And from that per foot basis, so the rule of thumb is if your land cost is, call it $100 per foot, maybe I think that might be the going rate in Northern Virginia right now. The infrastructure cost, namely the power distribution units plus cooling fixtures, those will add another $600 to $800 per foot. So you're talking about all in close to $1,000 per foot. And the rents, in the data center space, people use in megawatts, terms, but I will translate that into the real estate terms. Rents you will net, I think, between $60 to $80. If you have 5 cap on that, you're getting $1,200 to $1,400, which is Similar to one of the largest trade that happened, in the past year, where Mapletree bought a couple of data centers in Northern Virginia for $14,000.
Joe, since you're an investment banker, where are most of the financings taking place? Are they being done by the investment bankers, or is it being done through the Natixis of the world, or is it being done by private equity or the bond market? Because, you were just talking about a lease. You can take that lease and you can securitize that bond lease.
And this is not an effort to avoid the question, but the reality is it's happening all over the place. And I'll, again, maybe segment it because it's tough to paint it with a single brush. So if you look at the public REITs, and I'll use Digital and Equinix and CyrusOne as examples of those, those are all investment grade rated, entities that have ready access to both the public debt and public equity capital markets. So more often than not, when any of those parties have capital needs, they're generally using both the equity and the debt markets to facilitate those needs, and the demand for those offerings has been significant. Equinix just raised a substantial amount of equity capital to facilitate its acquisition of some properties from BCE. Digital Realty did a transaction with Interaction, which had a stock component to it, so effectively issued equity in that fashion. So the public REITs have, again, very stable and steady access to the public markets. On the private side, there has been a massive influx of infrastructure and pension fund and sovereign wealth money that has looked to deploy their capital across communications infrastructure broadly, but specifically in data centers, right? Because it's viewed as long-term protected and able to withstand cycles, including the most recent one that we're in, given the pandemic. So, when you think about the infrastructure capital, I'll just use that as an example. There's been probably $175 to $200 billion worth of infrastructure-oriented equity raised in the last few years. Roughly 20 to 25% of that is probably pointed toward digital infrastructure, and that's on an unlevered basis, right? So you're talking about something to the tune of $50 billion of capital looking to find a home in communications infrastructure broadly defined. Now that'll include towers and fiber networks and data centers, but you look across the number of companies that have portfolio assets. Stonepeak, Digital Colony, KKR just announced €1 billion backing of a program in Europe to go build data centers. And there are several others that have similar investments across the spectrum, from the Canadian pension funds all the way through the sovereign wealth funds. So capital has not been really I would say a problem for folks in the business. Now, where the problem exists is the person that looks at this space and they say, well, geez, the cash flows here trade at 25 to 30 times multiples, and I see the secular tailwinds going on in the space. I see the growth. I'm going to try to do a de novo build on a data center. People forget that not only is there a high level of expertise required in constructing and building a data center, but the clients that they ultimately want to serve generally have much more affinity to people who have, to use a football phrase, been in the end zone before, right? I mean, you're going to turn over your keys on your critical infrastructure and put your most important assets in somebody else's house. You want to make sure they know how to run the house. And that's where I think some of the challenges related to new upstarts in the sector have come about. Now, folks that have been operators or worked at big operators beforehand and have a credible track record generally find it pretty easy to find that financing. But for folks that decide they're going to go de novo, the opportunities aren't quite as robust.
Jerry, you're competing with all this other money. Why are people going to Natixis as opposed to a private equity or a sovereign wealth fund?
Yeah, we got cheap money.
Speaking of cheap money, so let's talk about a structure of a deal.
Well, Michael, just before you go there, just to make sure that I clarify, my reference was primarily around the equity portion of the balance sheet. obviously that equity that the infrastructure sovereign wealth pension fund is providing is being levered significantly by folks like Jerry and his brethren who are able to do that pretty efficiently.
Jerry, back to you.
Generally, we haven't seen like lots of termination, I guess, provisions. I mean, there are several types, you know, if depending on what kind of facilities you're talking about, be it a cloud, co-location, or retail, or edge, you have a different type of a contract, underlying contracts. So the leverage will vary between these amongst these different facilities. For cloud, if you have a long lease, I think we're comfortable, you know, having, you know, much higher leverage than you would otherwise do. You know, we can probably lend up to, you know, $1,000 per foot, which sounds crazy for real estate guys to even grasp. For the retail co-location, for example, if you have more turnovers, I think we generally want to be, you know, at 65% or lower. So it really depends on types of facilities and locations, connectivities, various factors.
So I think in summation, we know that the data center world is growing. We have investment bankers who understand the business rather well, especially the guys who run telecommunications for PJ Solomon. We have bankers who understand the financing of the world of data centers, Jerry Tang in Texas. And I'm Mike Stoller, and I'd like to thank you for being here today at this webinar brought to you by AmTrust Title, Stephen Napolitano, Executive Vice President. See you next week.